So I spent nearly 3 years living in a Buddhist monastery, and in that time I meditated over 5,000 hours. And it led to some things that completely changed the way I experienced life. So I wanted to share these things with you so you don't have to spend 5,000 hours meditating unless you want to, but you can start using them today. So when I first moved to the monastery, I was very, very depressed. So I'm somebody who had ignored my internal world and my emotions for most of my life. I didn't really understand how to deal with those. One of the reasons that I went there was because I was struggling with sexual dysfunction, and I had realized that it had to do with my emotions. So I moved to this beautiful monastery in 2016 that was set in the mountains of Vermont. We were up high on a mountain, just beautiful views of all the green trees. And it was September, so it was still relatively warm outside. But I was very depressed. And I went to the monastery because I'd been dealing with sexual dysfunction, and I realized that it had to relate to my emotions and whatever my mind. I didn't really understand, but I was hoping a lot of meditation would fix it. And so I was assigned one day to chop wood, which I really, really enjoy. But that particular day, I'd been really grumpy for about 2 weeks. It'd been, just a really challenging period. And I was walking back after chopping wood for hours. I had the axe over my shoulder, and I was just looking out at the beautiful mountains and just breathing in the fresh Vermont air. And I just had this really strange moment where I realized, I don't really want to be miserable anymore. And so like that, my mood changed for the first time in literally 2 weeks. That's the clearest realization that I've ever had, that being miserable is actually a choice. So what I will say is, despite the fact that I understand this, it's not always obvious. So sometimes when I'm feeling grumpy, I still forget that I can do something to change my emotional state. So if you're somebody who struggles with depression or sadness or fear or any emotional state, it's probably not obvious to you that there is something you can do to change it, but there always is. So emotions tend to carry a momentum. So modern Buddhists talk about this in terms of a record player. So old school record players, they'll spin and spin, and if you unplug them, they'll continue with some momentum for a while until the momentum finally goes away. Emotions are the same way. So even from that moment where I realized I didn't want to be miserable anymore, it took a little while for the emotion to totally go away. But emotions they come and they go. So if you've been stuck in one emotion, anger, frustration, fear, it's a choice. If you do the things that you're doing now, you'll continue to feel that way. But there are changes that you can make, just deciding I don't want to feel that way anymore, focusing on something else. Or if you have a really challenging emotion like anger, learning to work it out through your body. So if you're feeling miserable, you don't have to anymore. Find a way to change the way you feel. So this is a concept that I really enjoyed exploring while I was at the monastery. So the place that I was living, 1 week out of every month, we would spend in retreat. So we would be meditating 14 hours a day for a full week. It was crazy. If you've never done that, it's an amazing experience, but it's also very, very challenging. One of the things that I started to notice happening on retreat is that my mind would start to settle down. Usually around day 3, my body would start to relax. So I've had a lot of trauma in my life, and so my body holds some tensions from that. I've gotten rid of a lot of it, but during retreat, my muscles would start to relax. And as my muscles would relax, then my mind would actually start to go quiet, which is a really strange experience. But it happened often enough that I realized there's a very clear relationship between how much tension is in my body and how much tension is in my mind. And so when my body actually relaxes, my mind would relax with it. If you're somebody who's dealing with a lot of anxiety, or you are an overthinker, one of the things that I highly recommend is learning to relax. We have a weird concept of relaxation currently in the West. It's this idea that I'll just sit down on the couch and play with my phone or watch Netflix. But relaxation is talked about very differently in the East. Relaxation is actually a skill. 3 commonly known practices that are used to develop this skill are meditation, yoga, and then Tai Chi or Qigong. Those are not the same thing. If you're dealing with anxiety and stuff like that, what I would recommend is learn to adopt one of those practices into your everyday life. So I really love meditation, but for most people who are watching this, you're probably going to get a better return on your time doing something like Tai Chi or yoga, just because meditation is something where the skill level has a big impact on how much it can actually improve your situation. And so as I started to experience my mind relaxing, I started to look at what were the things that were actually causing it to feel disturbed on a day-to-day basis besides my body. I am somebody who had dealt with really bad porn addiction for most of my life. And while I was at the monastery, I started moving away from that. And I started focusing all of my energy away from sex. And when I started to realize not thinking about sex made me feel better than almost anything else that I'd done. I'd been obsessed with sexual things since I was like 7. It was just this constant need and search and like a hole that I couldn't fill. And so for the first time in my life, not having to focus on sex, it actually felt amazing. And it made it even easier to relax during retreats when I wasn't doing that. If you are especially a guy who's been, obsessing over sex, one of the things that I highly recommend is do a detox from sex. Just not even just like, hey, I'm not gonna have an orgasm, but try to not think about it for a while. I got to the point where I could go a month without thinking about sex, and it was incredibly freeing. It made me realize that at some weird level I was actually addicted to it, not realizing it. Not even addicted to sex, but addicted to thinking about sex. And so I felt like I got a lot of time and energy back just by doing that, which also made me feel happy. If you're wondering what things were like as I left, I actually did heal my sexual dysfunction, and when I left the monastery, since then I haven't actually been depressed. It was amazing. I feel like I got to experience this amazing journey inside my own mind and my own emotions, and I've learned a lot about what makes me miserable, both from just Buddhism in general and from my time spent watching my mind. But something where I don't recommend for most people to go to a monastery, because I'm talking about the very pleasant parts of it, but there's a lot of very uncomfortable things that happened as well. It's not an experience that most people probably need. But what I took out of it was absolutely life-changing, and I hope that those insights can help you too. I hope you enjoyed. That's my story.